time to talk with me and sharing insight into some of the ways you each work. Though there's so much that we could investigate. Specifically, what I'm interested in discussing today is your musical and compositional relationships to physical space. So I don't necessarily mean music written to be performed in a specific space, but rather music that is written about or inspired by a particular space. Eve, of course, the River Project and the large body of music that comes to mind came from that, but Osculati Furniture, the piece of yours that appears on my new record, was written after the travel journals your mother took in Umbria, if I'm not mistaken. And Paula, naturally the first piece of yours that I think of is on the imagined relations of night sounds and silent darkness, which also appears on the record, not to mention your other recent work surrounding the old Croton Aqueduct outside of New York. To begin, can each of you track the evolution of this aspect of work? Do you remember when this idea of a relationship to space became interesting to you or became something that you started working with?
Do you
want to go first, Paula?
Happy to. Thank you for the question. And congratulations on a few kites. Yay!
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so I've always been interested in space, in part because of my interest in electronics, also just like acoustics. But like with the works related to the Old Croton Aqueduct, that started, I'd say about in 2010, actually. First with the Atlantic Avenue Tunnel, which was completed in 1844 and is registered with the Brooklyn Historic Rail Association as like the world's first subway. But what's interesting about that is it's been a sort of a relationship that I'm interested in terms of, in the case of New York City, looking at the confluence of water and transportation technologies, but also to really kind of look at sort of what these lifelines of a city are, what relationships that implies in terms of the navigability of the city, as well as the resources that move in and out of the city. And so there's part of that in the case of the Old Croton Aqueduct, which is now defunct, but like is sites that are still available to look at and to have some encounters with the Friends of the Old Croton Aqueduct, which is part of how I've been able to garner some access to tunnels and things like that. But you know, there's something really interesting to me about cities, but just, I don't know, the thing I sort of liken it to, right, like is if I take an object and I put it in a drawer and then I open it up an hour later, I can pretend to be surprised by what I find in the drawer, right? But if I take that item and I put it in a drawer, then I bury it underground for like that whole desk or whatever, and like buried underground for 100 to 200 years. And then I like dig up that desk and then I find that object in there that I've long since forgotten about. Then it becomes something different. There's a different relationship there that kind of becomes a site of storytelling. And that's something that I'm interested in. And so the sort of sites of infrastructure I'm looking at always have some sort of intersection between what was imagined about what was possible for the city then and what its current status is in terms of how it intersects with contemporary infrastructure and the people who move in and out around it. And so in the case of the Old Croton Aqueduct, that was New York City's first supply of fresh water, which like, you know, New York had been plagued by fires, disease, and you know, and so like once fresh water came in 1842, then that was like a moment of great celebration and jubilation within the city. And so the Great Lawn was part of that effort. And or
the Great Lawn in Central Park, you mean?
Yeah. And prior to it being the Great Lawn, it was a receiving reservoir for the Old Croton Aqueduct. And so once the Old Croton Aqueduct was built, and then what we have is a huge population boom in the city, so much so that the demands for water then exceed what that aqueduct was capable of supplying. That then leads to the construction of the new Croton Aqueduct. Old Croton Aqueduct becomes defunct, becomes filled in. That's where Olmsted and Vogt come in terms of their design, redesign of that space. They fill in that reservoir, and so they hated the rectangular shape of it, so they really tried to design around that. But so consequently, what you have right now in that park as a result of this history is that there's this massive open space that has baseball diamonds. And so if you walk around through that park, you'll find manholes that say like Old Croton Aqueduct on it, like from the 1860s. But then you'll also find some retaining walls along the traverses, particularly like the 86th Street Traverse and things like that, which used to be tied to the retaining walls of the aqueduct. So there's things like that where it's sort of like, oh, that was there this whole time, but we didn't realize it. And part of it is that, part of it is this sort of element of, like, I think of something too, like I turn on the running tap in my apartment and think like, wow, this is a modern miracle. We have fresh running water, but like, it kind of is, and there's part of it where it's looking at those relationships in terms of how they're historically bound, and in a way not taking for granted what we have around us. And so there's something that's really interesting about going to a space and realizing that the moment that you're making sound in it actually intersects with all these different things. And it's a question about where you draw your attention in relationship to that. And so that was part of what I was interested in with that, because I knew that there would be something interesting about the park. Sonically, parks are just very, very interesting, I think, in general. But I also wanted to like play with that idea of darkness and the park after dark, the park in the dark, because there's a very clear sort of switch in valence there in terms of whether it's read as a safe space or not a safe space. And so being able to sort of listen overnight was this one thing that I was also really interested in that regard as well. And so,
oh, awesome.
Yeah, that was.
Did you camp out in the park in order to capture that sound?
No, that would have been a lot harder. But what I did was I mapped out the path of roughly what the shape was, and tried to find interesting spots along the way. And so what would happen is that in the evening, Andy would intone a sort of fragment of music that, and then I'd have at least 2 recording devices set up, Zoom H1s with really long, really large cards on them, and just kind of hide them in trees or bushes or things like that. And I usually tried to keep them out of the way of people, because I didn't want to eavesdrop on people. Like, right, like, what I wanted was to sort of hear these different spaces, and then just let them run. And then it was like kind of that wonderful fun thing of like getting to hang out with Andy the night before, and then like, crashing out, and then like getting up at the crack of dawn the next morning and just walking into the park, like going on my little like sound Easter egg hunt or something like that, and trying to find the recorders and hope that they made it through the night. And with all but one exception, they did. So it was cool.
That's really cool.
Eve, do you remember, or can you sort of track when this sort of thing, I mean, was it always there for you, or was it a thing that became more and more interesting like throughout your career?
Well, it's so interesting. When you asked that question, I was sort of waylaid, and which is why I was staring off into space in response to the question, because I was trying to think if place was super important to pieces of mine prior to going down the Mississippi River. And I'm not sure that place was particularly important to me prior to the river project. But what's so interesting is that subsequent to going down the river, I can't imagine it not being important. So it's really interesting how that shifted my whole practice and my whole way of thinking about where ideas come from, and so on. So that's really interesting, and sort of waylaid me. I'd never thought of it before. Yeah.
Paula, in the Ives piece that so we did these intonements that were excerpts of Central Park in the dark. Can you talk a little bit about why Ives, or why specifically that piece, aside from the title, if there was anything aside from the title? And then I'm also interested in when you had to sift through these hours and hours and hours of recorded material, what did you look for, or what were you trying to find? How did you sort of prioritize material?
Yeah, good question. Well, okay, so first is one of just like very simple association, which is I can't help it. I think of trumpet, and I have such an Ivesian association with that. Like I love it. And But like that piece, part of what's important to me about that piece is that it is in Ives' notes, introductory notes for it, he talks about it as like a sound in pictures. Some many years ago, like, and before the, what was it? Before the combustion engine and radio ruled the earth, kind of thing like that. So like part of what he's, I'm messing up the quote, but like part of what's happening is that he's imagining a soundscape from years ago. And so there's something that's really interesting about that being written into the piece in terms of all the overlapping sonic fragments for that. And that was something that I was interested in as well, because the sounds that, some of the things he references in the notes are things like the sounds of the occasional elevated. And that was back when a lot of those train lines were elevated as well. And so that sort of sound would have been part of this like loud soundscape. And then like the newsboys calling uxtrees, which I've never heard that word before. Like,
how do you spell that? What is that word?
UXTRIES, uxtrees.
Huh. What is that? That was like a by the news sort of thing?
Yeah.
No way.
Well, I think so. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's it. I defer to Eve, who's more poetic than me. But,
I'm curious. I'm trying to look it up. No, I'm not finding it.
But like, point being that it's an imagined soundscape, and I felt that was something that was opened up the door for this, right? Like, and so, and part of like wanting to go, you know, we did those recordings and we deliberately spread it out over the course of the whole summer because I wanted to play with that as a long time frame as well, that sort of transition from early summer to late summer. And there's all these great sounds, right? Like definitely some of the things I got were like the sound of Shakespeare in the park, right? Like, or you know, the sounds of when the cicadas start, or like certain insects that like cue different parts of the summer. And then there's one too that was where we sort of projected a recording that you made because you were out of town, I remember, but it was like we did it on July 4th because I wanted the sound of fireworks that as they sounded in Central Park, you know, things like that. And so it was kind of playing with some of those things, in some cases being strategic and others being completely open to whatever the situation welcomed. But then what was interesting, right, like was then listening across those, like I did, you know, for some friends of mine who've done like major long durational field recording projects, they've set up algorithms to kind of read what's the most like interesting part in an extended file. But like, I kind of just wanted to be systematic about going through it, but also leave it completely open in a way. So I just broke it down in 2-hour segments because from each segment I had a 13-hour recording times 2. So that was 26 hours per each recording session. And so in a sense, I just like, really was like, okay, so let's look at like, midnight to 2 a.m. here. Let's look at 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. here. Like,
and did you listen to every minute of all of those tapes?
No, it's impossible. I mean, like I've tried that. I tried that previously. I mean, someone maybe could, but it's a different type of listening. Like, so prior to that, I've been doing recordings in Inwood Hill Park, which was part of a failed project, but like listening in real time to everything as it's happening, you know, you just fall asleep.
Right.
Like, and it's soothing in a way, but like it's just there's part of it which is like opening things up in terms of like part of what's interesting to me, right, like is 4 a.m. and so that, like 4 a.m. is really interesting because like in the city that never sleeps, it is profoundly asleep, like and there's something really beautiful I think about being in some place that is so densely populated and it's so quiet, you know. And so what was fascinating to me too is like, you know, playing with some of those moments where it would just be quiet. And then also like, then right at clockwork, you know, the birds start chirping and it was like, you know, every single time. And it was just amazing. And so kind of getting a sense of what those rhythms were really, were intriguing as part of that. But I did not like, if I were to start doing it all over again, it would definitely be different. And like, because I would just find different samples, you know. And I think part of it too is, you know, the sort of vision of what we had, like the Ives excerpts that we chose. I ended up drawing fairly few, I had a lot of ideas of how that would be processed in the end, and I threw a lot of them out because like the sonic information of what was in the environment was so interesting. And then your sort of hearing the sort of transition of your sound across those recordings was so interesting that like, trying to make it overly complicated with all this other sort of stuff, like just
it
like,
clutters.
Yeah, and so it just like I kept stripping it away until that's
fantastic. Eve, one of the things that's really clear to me in your music, both in terms of Ascolati Forniture, but also the River Project, is that it's clear that the location is important, or that certain aspects of the music was inspired purely by the location that you, or in the case of Ascolati, your mom were in. But perhaps more often the focus feels like it's on the people that inhabited the locations or shared those spaces with you. Can you talk to the relationship between physical space and personal relationship that arises from these confluences and inspires the work, or helps to direct the work?
Yeah, I mean, I think people and places are completely combined in sort of almost all of the pieces going down the river. They are definitely located in a particular location, but there's also a person involved. I think of, say, the trombone piece.
The trombone, the quartet.
Yes.
And then out of the game.
In and out of the game. Yeah.
In and out of the game. Yes. Thank you so much. I
love
filmed.
these.
Yeah, right.
I love these.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I filmed it before going into town and meeting this man who told me about being suicidal and having almost committed suicide and then having not committed suicide. And so in a sense, I made the piece for him in response to that conversation we had had. And yet, when I was out on the river filming the birds, I had not yet met him. So in a certain sense, and in fact, that music was written a year before I went down the river. So it's sort of as if individual pieces of material don't coalesce until either the right person or the right place or some combination of both comes together to make that piece want to exist, right? And in a certain way, that's sort of how Ascolati Forniture works, right? That piece, I was in Umbria learning about classical Persian music for a commission completely unrelated to Ascolati Forniture, which was in fact not a commission. It was for the LA Master Chorale with traditional Persian instrumentalists, right? And so I was studying Persian classical music because I don't know anything about it. And one of the ways that you do that is you go through this book of sort of, well, there's no, of sort of melodic fragments that go with each scale. I'm saying that probably really badly, and if you were a Persian traditional instrumentalist, you would correct me, but it'll do for right now. And so the tape part is that, and it's offset and turned into a tape part with then a melody that you and I sort of do as a secret duet, right, Andy? And the title comes from this journal entry of my mother's when she was in Tuscany, and she writes the question, what is Ascolati Forniture? While she's talking about the shutters in Lucca and overhearing a conversation in the bus that she's riding in with some aged nuns talking about that the last time they'd seen each other was on a walking tour of Zimbabwe. And you can imagine how they say the word Zimbabwe, you know, these, and so it's sort of shot through with this Italianness, this Persian thing, the fact that my father grew up in Tehran, and the fact that this is my mother's journal asking what Ascolati Forniture means, which is in fact completely mysterious. I don't know what it means, right? I mean, osculations, we know from Einstein on the Beach, is like wiggling. So kissing, right? Fervent osculations, that end, that last knee play, the climax of Einstein on the Beach. So beautiful, right? And so that's what osculate means is to wiggle, basically. And fourniture, spelled that way, is a particular organ stop. But it's also, I believe, maybe how you spell furniture in Italian. I don't know. It doesn't seem right to me, right?
Right.
So could she have glimpsed an advertisement and misread it and thought, because she was trained as an organist, so she would have known the word fourniture. Right. So here's this whole relation of things, which are all sort of related to one another osculately, right? Because they're actually not related to each other, but maybe they are. And somehow they all come together to make this piece, right? So is that place-based? In a way, it's completely place-based. For me,
right. It couldn't have existed if it wasn't for those places.
And if I hadn't been in Umbria studying Persian music and then coming across this journal of my mother's, like none of those pieces would have come together into one place without in each individual one.
Right. That's fascinating. I wonder, so this is a little bit of a different kind of question. So one of the ways that we can think about what politics is, or what politics are like the complexity of the relationships of people living in society. And so if we take it like very generally like that, how and why man-made physical spaces are designed, built, developed, and maintained are naturally political. Paula, when you're developing musical work that's dealing with the aqueduct or its relationship to the city, or what it means for the people that are using this infrastructure, or Eve, same question, but regarding the infrastructure you came in contact with on the river, do you think of your music as being, or the music that we're talking about today as being political or related to like that aspect of space? Whoever can go first.
Yes. That's cute. I mean, it's complicated, right? Like, so as with anything that, like, I mean, as we've been talking about too, it's like so many of these things are inescapable, right? Like, and so like with infrastructure, yes, of course, like it's anyone that says infrastructure is easily, like, you should be suspicious of, right? So like, I think like infrastructure, like when you're talking about the deployment and the systematic planning of how resources will be used, and the labor and the materials that are used to then sort of delegate those, it's going to be political, like, and it always has been. And so there's part of that, which is what's interesting then, it's like, okay, well, what does it mean if we approach that musically, right? Like, because there's, you know, like, so like parks, for example, like part of my interest in that is sort of like having this idea of that like sound goes places where our bodies cannot. And that's something that intrigues me, in part because it opens up possibilities for exchange, possibilities for intersection across time, and also just for invitation in terms of thinking about things differently. And so like in the case of like what's been, you know, like in the case of the park, for example, like that sort of question of like, if you go there in the daytime, it's like a place that's safe for kids. If you go in the nighttime, watch out, you're taking your life into your own hands, kind of thing. And sort of like, why is that? Like, you know, and so playing with that as a sort of, as a creative prompt in a way, but then also kind of being realizing, like, for example, okay, like what has value, what sticks around, those sort of things that like, you know, so like if, like with the Croton Aqueduct work, right? Like there's this beautiful masonry that I love like recording and like having being able to spend some time with, but like that's this beautiful brick masonry that's in place in part because the labor to lay the bricks was cheaper than the materials, than other materials to use, such as like different types of metals and things like that, which would have had a different sound. why do things get to stick around? So like when I was in Rome recording aqueducts there, right? Like, so these beautiful arches stick around, but like had they been covered in gold or jewels or things like that, you can bet that it would be gutted and be repurposed someplace else.
Right.
So they stick around in part because they don't have value at, you know, for the system at the time. But then you wait long enough or something like that, then maybe it offers something else. But I don't know, it's always shifting, it's complex. We don't know what the relationships are always going to be, but I think there's something there to poke at creatively. And that's, and part of what I like with playing with it with sound is that it is a sloppy signifier. It's not a one-to-one or a linear relationship. It is something that opens up more doors, I think, than it can close. And so that's something that I find is part of the appeal in terms of working this way for me.
I like that idea of sound being a sloppy signifier.
I have to give credit where that's due, because that is some of the parlance of my colleague Ron Cuevila, who says sound is a sloppy signifier, and I totally agree with him.
That's really fantastic. It's like it helps to sort of clarify why political music or why music generally can be difficult, but also why it's, I think we all agree, like the absolute best.
One of the things that strikes me about your piece, Paula, is that it's political in the sense that all those implications about infrastructure and its presence and absence and all of that, but it's also historical in that you've got the Central Park of the present day, or in fact of pre-2020, right? Because it is clearly pre-COVID. That Central Park soundscape is not COVID soundscape, right? Which is also quite interesting to me to think about, that we hear this piece now totally differently than we would have heard it a year ago, because the soundscape of New York has been so transformed.
Right, or if we tried to use the same ideas but do it this summer,
it'd be a totally different piece, right?
Right.
But also you've got Ives's version of Central Park, which is a particular decade in the early 20th century, right? And then you've got the old Croton Aqueduct moment of Central Park, which is when the Great Lawn was actually a reservoir, which was totally news to me, and it's totally fascinating to learn about. And I'm wondering if you hear the water in that space. I'm curious whether it's audible to you, sort of.
Like on a metaphorical level, sort of.
Yes. Yes.
Interesting. Like, I think part of what I always find something different with it, but like, so, yeah, it's like, you know, that sort of Derrida quote, right? Like in Archive Fever, where he says like the archive creates while it destroys, kind of thing. And so there's part of that I always think about, where like, and sort of the example of like putting something in a drawer and then being surprised to find it, but given enough time, then like it becomes interesting again. Because there's part of that question too, like what sticks around, you know? And so I think in some of the cases of the, like hearing the water and things like that too, is like you hear the resonance of the way one structure then kind of informs another. And so there's a resonance there, but like, it's not one that we might always, expect, but then it becomes like, when you make that linkage, then it becomes exciting somehow because it's palpable to your lived experience and connects to something else.
Right, and then of course, we've learned that Central Park was also an African-American neighborhood that was cleared, namely destroyed, in order to make way for middle-class parkland, right? Which has been heavily policed against Black people making use of it as parkland, right? So you've got all of that going on. So it's both sonic, geographical, political, historical, and trying to sort out which is which, to me, seems to be like missing the point, because it's all of a piece, right? In a way that gives me great pleasure. I mean, I really love your piece for that reason, that I can't peel all those layers apart.
No,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Paula.
Oh, sorry. No. Thank you.
I was just going to ask, Eve, how do you think about, I know the answer that yes, you think of your music as being political, and having played a lot of it, there is like, that's there, but how do you think about that in the relationship between, the fact that like just us taking up space essentially is political, right? Like those relationships between people and negotiating power. And
I mean, in a way, my urge for going down the river in the first place was a belated response to Hurricane Katrina, and to thinking about the Mississippi River as the spine of the country, to thinking about river control structures as, after all, both the cause and the result of hurricanes and of the destruction of the wetlands of Louisiana. And also that by traveling from northern Minnesota down to Louisiana, what you're doing is traveling from the genocide lands of Native American habitation down across the Mason-Dixon line, to which passes through sites of real horror, racial horror, like say East St. Louis, and the Trail of Tears, and the Vicksburg, the sites of Civil War battles, and so on, to get to New Orleans. So the whole history of European American habitation of this country is completely contained in that journey, and what's fascinating is the degree to which that remains present and the degree to which that is washed away, right? And in fact, the Native American habitation, because it lay lightly on the land, to use your metaphor of packing the desk, with something in it, there's no desk, right? So if there's a place in the early river that was a gathering place in the summer for the Ojibwe from many thousands of miles around, on Lake Pepin, and they would grow rice there. So there was a sort of in summer they stayed put. They weren't traveling around, they were staying put and growing rice. And that's where they hung out in the summer, we know this to be the case, but we don't actually see remnants of that, even though it was a major city. I mean, there were thousands of people living there every summer for many decades, maybe hundreds of years. We don't really know. So that's quite interesting, how European technology tends to hang around, right? Like in the stream in my land, if you follow the stream, there's this marble bridge in the middle of the woods, and it's beginning to disintegrate, but it's a bridge made of marble, for God's sake, right? And it's completely mysterious why it's there and what it signifies. Was it part of an aqueduct for the town? I really don't know. It is none of those things now. It's nothing. It's garbage, but it's permanent garbage. The remnants of that marble are going to be there for the next 1,000 years, right? And so that's in and of itself this fascinating marker of the arrogance of different cultures that I can't get over, right? I can't stop thinking about. And certainly by the time you get to the lower Mississippi, it's been channelized to within an inch of its life. It's basically a concrete, it's a superhighway. It's an interstate, right? Which means that all the dirt that the river has scoured is now going off the edge of the Gulf, of some cliff in the Gulf. And that's why Louisiana is disappearing, right? Because we've done that. And until we figure out some other thing to do, if we figure out some other thing to do, we're just going to continually erode Louisiana, which means New Orleans will disappear in no time, you know?
Right.
So sorry, I'm raving, but
no, it's super fascinating. And I think that there's also there's a very clear connection between this idea of, the two very different infrastructures that you're both sort of looking at in varying ways, and the sort of permanence of them, certainly they're not permanent, but they're going to be around for a really long time. Even the idea that these old aqueducts are still, despite the fact that they're unused, they're still there, in that Central Park is still there and the Great Lawn is still there and will be there probably for a very long time. I think that's a very interesting thing.
I don't know, I'd definitely encourage you to read, if you haven't already, Alan Weisman's The World Without Us.
Yeah, I've heard that's really wonderful, probably from you, actually.
Oh, sorry.
No, please.
I mean, it ties to some of the same things of Central Park sticks around because there's a whole lot of resources that are being poured into it. So again, the politics of it can never be left behind, right? It's that sort of thing of if everyone were raptured, then you really start to see the way that nature takes over, because we are aggressively working against it a lot of the time, and that's kind of part of the nature of this as well, I guess.
Right.
Yeah.
No, sorry. No. I was just gonna say the last thing I wanted to ask, and I realize that this is maybe a little bit of a tricky question, because I know that we're all friends and like each other, but I wonder why. I'm really interested in why, because I love both of your music and I know why I love it and why I love playing it, and I know that you each really like each other's music also. I'm curious if even in just a few sentences, if you were able to sort of distill what it is that you like about each other's work. Because I feel like you actually have a lot in common, despite the fact that your music is very different. At least, sort of that's how I experience it.
I mean, in a way, I think our conversation has illustrated that in a sense, because so many of the things that each of us is thinking about are shared, even if the way that we manifest them musically might look different or sound different on the surface, but I'll just say what I love, which I think is not as clear in the conversation we've had, is the sense of theater in the moment in your pieces as well. So you've got space and sound, but you've also got the theater of space and sound going on in any live performance of your music, Paula, in a way that I think is so rich and so generous. And it creates this space in the performance space that's a different space than perhaps the space you're working with in the pre-recorded material. But it's a beautiful thing, and so that's what I would say.
Oh. Taking notes, I'm I have so much to learn from Eve. But it's true. I don't know. I still remember. I first came in contact with your work through Hilda Girls, and just I was 19, and that made a huge impression on me. So and it's just I love the way your work. I don't know. I was trying to think about it too, because it's just I think part of you can delete this if it makes you feel awkward at all. So, but like it has all these layers where I feel like I love that they're distilled to these things that I can perceive in terms of what they are when I'm first introduced to them, and then I can see their relationship, and yet it points at things that are both like with in and out of the game, for example, too, like things that like have this hurt underneath them and they're completely unafraid to go there, and yet can be completely joyous at the same time. And it opens up a world of just complete rich emotional complexity to me that like gives me hope. Yeah, just, and I love it. Like it, you know, and I think that that's something that even in I remember the closing moment of Hilda Girls where you're playing these like MIDI sticks, and I was like, woohoo! And it was the kind of thing where like it opened up this historical text in this way that was completely inviting and engaging, and like, and then even doing it in this way that you do for A Few Kites, like for that piece, it's like so personal, but then it opens it up in this beautiful way. And I love that you said a secret duo, because there's something about that that's like, because we're singing on it, right? Like I feel like I heard your voice in that, and like that is just like this sort of thing that it's like involving all these layers of travel, like family, like musical family, like, and then it's completely unafraid to be intimate with it, and the way that it ends with Andy's like Andy with your just like held tone at the end of it is just like, it's perfect. Like I love it. It's just really, really effective and moving and just completely, yeah, well done. Anyway.
Andy gets lots of credit for that because it's his choice how much of me to use in that secret duo, and he calibrated that in this really, I thought, really beautiful way.
As much Eve as possible. That's the yeah, it's fascinating to me knowing, like learning what composers like about other composers' music. I think that that's a thing. Yeah, and maybe it's less of a thing now than it has been in the past, but I feel like so much of the discussion can end up devolving into what we don't like about other people's things. That it's nice to talk about, like, because there's so much good stuff. What is good about it? What is it that we like? What about it is moving? And often I find that it, like hearing, for instance, Paula, you talking about Eve's music, and hearing what you have to say is like, oh yeah, that's why I like it too. That's like one of the ways, but you're hearing it framed in a way that helps to make sense of what you're feeling, or rather what I am feeling about the music. It's great. I think that's just about it. So thanks very much for spending some time talking about these things. Thanks to everyone who listened, and thanks for checking out both Paula and Eve's tracks on A Few Kites.
Yay, and check out the whole album. It's beautiful.
And check out the whole album.
And it's so delightful to hang with both of you.
As always.
Yes, love.